What happens when a luxury store manager judges a man by his appearance? A surprising twist reveals the truth behind the brand's success. Don't miss this eye-opening story. On a crisp autumn afternoon in downtown Los Angeles, Marcus Thompson stood quietly at the corner of Rodeo Drive, blending seamlessly into the hustle and bustle of the city. The light breeze tousled his dark jacket, making him pull the collar up slightly. His cap was pulled low, enough to obscure his face, but still allow him to see the elegant parade of shoppers moving in and out of the luxury boutiques. The tall, sleek building in front of him caught his attention. It was one of the most successful stores in his chain, a symbol of class, prestige, and wealth. The store's large windows reflected the golden afternoon light, casting a serene glow across the polished marble floors inside. Marcus had always prided himself on creating spaces that made people feel both luxurious and at home. This particular store had been one of his personal projects, and he had watched it grow into something special. But today, he was not the proud owner who people knew him to be. Today, he was just another shopper, dressed casually in dark jeans, a plain black hoodie, and sneakers. He wanted to observe the reality of his store, away from the polished image his name brought. This wasn't about luxury or status. It was about seeing how people were treated when their worth wasn't immediately visible. His heart beat faster as he stepped forward, his shoes tapping softly against the ground as he approached the entrance. The door opened with a soft chime, and as he walked inside, he felt a familiar weight settle over him. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with soft jazz playing in the background. Everything was the same, too familiar, too perfect. But something inside him shifted. Today, he wasn't the owner. He was a man trying to see if the respect he built his business on was being extended to everyone who entered. And deep down, he already knew that he was about to uncover something unexpected, something that would change everything. As Marcus wandered through the store, the polished marble floors beneath his feet gleamed with an almost unnerving perfection. The soft hum of ambient jazz seemed to whisper around him, accentuating the luxurious surroundings. He walked slowly, allowing himself to absorb the fine details. Designer watches nestled carefully in their display cases, custom-tailored suits hanging pristinely on velvet-lined racks, and a subtle, almost intoxicating scent of expensive cologne that lingered in the air. His eyes scanned the space, familiar with each item, but now seeing them with fresh, unfamiliar perspective. Then out of the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed the store manager, a man in his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair, adjusting a display near the front. His name was Thomas Reed, the kind of person who always wore a suit that looked a little too tight around the waist. Marcus watched as Thomas chatted with a well-dressed woman, his smile polished and practiced, but there was something in his posture, something dismissive in the way he carried himself, that made Marcus' stomach tighten. Thomas noticed Marcus then, his eyes quickly scanning the casually dressed man standing in front of the watch case. A subtle frown crossed his face, one that didn't go unnoticed by Marcus. He had been around long enough to recognize the familiar shift in expression, the judgment that came from someone who assumed they knew who could afford what and who couldn't. Marcus' pulse quickened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral as he picked up a sleek silver watch, its weight cool in his hands. "Excuse me," Marcus spoke, his voice calm but with an edge of politeness that contrasted sharply with the growing discomfort in his chest. "Could you tell me more about this watch?" Thomas approached with deliberate slowness, the practiced smile on his face faltering as his eyes flicked over Marcus' casual outfit. His tone was clipped, as if speaking to someone who was wasting his time. "That's one of our limited edition pieces. Not exactly what someone like you would be looking for." The word stung more than Marcus expected. He had come to observe, to see beyond the polished facade of his business, but now he felt a burning sense of frustration rising in him. His hand clenched around the watch. "Why is that?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Thomas hesitated, clearly sizing Marcus up as if trying to assess whether the man could even understand the true value of the item in his hands. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice now dripping with condescension. "Well," he said slowly, "this watch is crafted by one of the finest Swiss watchmakers. It's made from the highest quality materials, and there are only a handful of these in the world. It's not something you'd typically find on someone like, well, someone who's just browsing, so to speak." Marcus felt the words hang in the air, the implication clear. He had been reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of this man. It wasn't the first time he'd experienced such treatment. After all, this was the kind of thing he'd dealt with in his youth, but now it felt different. This time, it wasn't just a random cashier or a rude sales associate. This was Thomas, the manager of his own store, someone who was supposed to represent the values of his brand. Marcus held the watch up, admiring the craftsmanship, despite the irritation rising within him. "I see," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of challenge. "So, you're telling me that only people who dress a certain way are worthy of buying this? What about the people who appreciate quality, no matter how they look?" Thomas's smile tightened, the tension between them growing. "Well, we have a specific clientele here. The kind of people who know what they can afford and what they can't. It's all about image, you know? Maintaining the brand's integrity," he explained, his words dripping with an air of superiority. Marcus' lips curled into a subtle smirk, his mind already working to twist the conversation. "So if I could afford it, you'd let me walk out with it? No questions asked." Thomas's eyes flickered, uncertainty momentarily flashing across his face. He quickly masked it, but not before Marcus caught it. "Of course," he said a little too quickly. Marcus gave a short nod, then placed the watch back in the display case. "I think I'll pass. But thanks for the insight." As he turned to leave, he could feel the heat of Thomas's gaze on his back, a mix of judgment and disbelief. Marcus couldn't help but laugh softly to himself as he pushed open the door. He had come here expecting to witness the reality of his store, without the privilege of his title. What he hadn't expected was to be reminded of the lengths people would go to protect their prejudices, even in the face of true quality. Marcus stepped back out into the crisp air of Rodeo Drive, the cool breeze ruffling his jacket. He could still feel the sting of Thomas's dismissive tone, like a bad taste in his mouth that he couldn't quite shake. As he walked along the sidewalk, his mind raced with the implications of what he had just witnessed. He had come to the store expecting to see the luxury, the exclusivity, the image that made his business stand out, but instead, he had seen something far more troubling, an attitude of elitism and judgment that went against everything he stood for. He couldn't just let it slide. Not this time. Marcus stopped at a corner and took a deep breath, grounding himself. He had learned over the years that confronting people like Thomas wasn't about anger or confrontation. It was about principle. He had built his business on respect for others, on the idea that everyone deserved the chance to experience the best, no matter who they were or how they looked. And now, he had to make sure that principle was more than just a slogan. With newfound resolve, Marcus turned on his heel and walked back toward the store. This time, he was no longer just a shopper. He was the man who built this brand, the one whose name was above the door. The door chimed again as he entered, and he could immediately sense a shift in atmosphere. Thomas was still at the counter, now with his back turned, but Marcus could see the tension in the air. The moment the door closed behind him, Thomas stiffened. Marcus strode purposefully toward him, his gaze unwavering. "Thomas," Marcus said, his voice smooth, but with an edge that sent a chill through the air. "I think it's time we talk." Thomas looked up, his smile faltering slightly as he recognized a man who stood before him. He opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off before he could say anything. "I didn't come here to play games. I came here to see the truth, and now I know exactly what's been happening under your watch." Thomas's face turned pale, and his posture shrank slightly. It was as if the weight of his own actions had finally caught up with him, and Marcus could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. "You didn't just judge me based on my appearance," Marcus continued, his voice calm, almost disarmingly so. "You judged every person who doesn't fit your narrow idea of who deserves luxury, and that's not something I can ignore." For a moment, they both stood in silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Thomas spoke, his voice tight. "I didn't mean—" Marcus cut him off again, the calm stillness in his voice giving way to a quiet fury. "Don't. You've already made your point. And now I'm making mine." Marcus walked out of the store again, the sound of the door chime ringing in his ears. But this time, it wasn't the feeling of frustration that lingered. No, this time it was something more calculated, a quiet storm brewing in his chest. He had been polite, too polite, and it was clear that Thomas wasn't going to change without a wake-up call. He needed to act. Marcus didn't just want to confront the behavior he had witnessed. He wanted to correct it. It was his responsibility, not just as an owner, but as a person who would work hard to build something that reflected the values of fairness, inclusivity, and respect. He wasn't about to let someone like Thomas destroy that in one afternoon. The decision had been made. That night, Marcus sat in his office, staring out at the sprawling city below, the lights of Los Angeles twinkling like distant stars. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a managerial issue. This was a statement he had to make, not just for his store, but for his employees, his customers, and for himself. By morning, he had a plan in place. He called his assistant, Lisa, to arrange a meeting with Thomas the next day. Marcus wasn't the type to be rash, but he knew now that he needed to shake things up before it got worse. A man like Thomas didn't get to hide behind his position of power, not in Marcus's world. When Thomas arrived at the corporate office the next day, he still had that self-assured air about him. His suit was sharp, his tie was tight, and his face was still smug, as if he believed he could talk his way out of anything. Marcus met him in the conference room, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. "Thomas," Marcus said coolly, "you've made a mistake, and now you'll see exactly how big it is." He leaned back in his chair, watching the panic begin to creep into Thomas's eyes. Thomas stumbled slightly as Marcus's words landed, his face draining of color. For a moment, he looked almost unrecognizable, caught off guard by the realization that the man he had just dismissed as an average shopper was, in fact, the owner of the very store he managed. His mouth opened and closed, searching for a response, but none came. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, as Marcus let the moment sink in. Marcus sat back, folded his arms across his chest, his gaze unwavering. He was calm, but the weight of his words hung in the air like an iron bar. "You didn't recognize me yesterday. That's fine, but your behavior? Your assumptions about people based on how they look, how they dress, that's the real problem here. And that's not something I can let slide." Thomas finally found his voice, though it wavered. "Mr. Carter, I didn't mean to—" Marcus interrupted him, his tone cold and precise. "Let me stop you right there, Thomas. It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did. The way you treated me wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, and that's the problem. You've been doing this with every customer who doesn't fit your idea of luxury." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to regain some control over the situation. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. I didn't realize. I didn't know it was you. I just thought—" "You thought what, Thomas?" Marcus's voice cut through the air, sharp and unforgiving. "That only people in $2,000 suits and shiny shoes are worthy of luxury? That a person's value is determined by what they're wearing? That's what you thought." Thomas's face twisted with guilt and frustration. His earlier confidence had vanished completely, leaving a man who was now painfully aware of his own shortcomings. He opened his mouth to say something, but Marcus was already on the move, standing up and pacing slowly. "I've spent years building a brand that stands for respect, inclusion, and integrity. I don't care what a person wears or what they look like. I care about the quality of their experience with us. Your attitude doesn't just hurt me. It hurts every single person who walks through that door, hoping to be treated with dignity." For a moment, it seemed as though Thomas was going to crumble under the weight of Marcus's words. He looked down at his hands, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. But Marcus was done. He had heard enough. "Thomas, I won't tolerate this kind of behavior. Not in my stores, not anywhere. You've lost the privilege of being a part of this company." The room fell into a heavy silence as Marcus turned and walked toward the door, leaving Thomas to stew in the consequences of his actions. He had made his point, but there was still one more thing to do. Marcus knew he had to make sure the right values were instilled in every corner of his business, and that meant it was time for change. The next morning, Marcus walked into his office with a purpose that had been building all night. The phone call he had made to his assistant, Lisa, had been brief but direct. He wasn't wasting any more time. It was time for the consequences to match the actions, and Thomas was going to feel it hard. The reality of what had happened in the store the day before was still fresh in his mind, and he knew what had to be done. When Thomas arrived at the headquarters, the air was thick with tension. Marcus was already seated at the head of the sleek conference table, looking every bit the composed businessman he was. But behind his cool exterior was a quiet storm of indignation that simmered just beneath the surface. The door opened and Thomas stepped in, his movements stiff, his eyes darting around nervously. The usual confident swagger was gone, replaced by a hesitant shuffle. "Have a seat, Thomas," Marcus said, his voice even, though the weight of his words was clear. He gestured to the chair across from him. "I'm sure you know why you're here." Thomas sat down slowly, wiping his palms on his trousers, his eyes not quite meeting Marcus's. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, neither of them willing to speak first. Finally, Marcus broke the stillness. "Yesterday, you showed me exactly how deep the problem runs in that store. It wasn't just a mistake or a poor judgment call. It was a mindset, one that's been harming the reputation of this brand, and I can't let it continue." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze hardening. "You've shown that you don't understand the core values of this company. You've acted as if luxury is for a select few, based on the way they look or what they wear." Thomas opened his mouth, probably to protest, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him. "I don't need to hear excuses, Thomas. It's too late for that. You've undermined the integrity of the brand I've worked so hard to build." The words hit Thomas like a ton of bricks. His face flushed a deep shade of crimson as Marcus continued. "I don't regret what I'm about to do. Effective immediately, you're no longer with the company." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of Thomas's heavy breathing. His shoulders slumped, the realization settling in like a dark cloud. Marcus didn't care to dwell on the drama. He had made his decision. "Now," Marcus said, standing up, "I suggest you gather your things and go. We'll be taking a new direction, one that values respect over exclusivity." As Thomas shuffled out of the room, his eyes lowered in defeat, Marcus allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The decision had been hard, but it was necessary. He could already feel the first stirrings of a new beginning, one where every person who walked into a store would feel valued, no matter their appearance. And that was just the start. The moment Thomas left the conference room, Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. But it was quickly replaced by the realization that the real work was just beginning. It wasn't enough to simply fire someone who had lost sight of the company's values. Marcus had to ensure that his business, from the ground up, was aligned with the principles he'd always believed in. As he walked out his office, he immediately called Lisa. "It's time to turn this ship around," he said, his voice steady but determined. "Get Sarah in here. We need to talk about the future." A few minutes later, Sarah, the store's most loyal and diligent employee, walked into Marcus's office. Her youthful enthusiasm had always impressed him, and he knew she was the right person to help steer the store toward the change he envisioned. "Sarah," Marcus began, motioning for her to sit, "we need to rebuild what's been broken. I've just let Thomas go. His mindset was toxic to what we're trying to build here. I want you to lead the store moving forward. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands what our brand stands for. Will you do it?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, her fingers instinctively tapping the edge of her notebook as she processed his words. She was barely 30, still relatively new to the management role, but Marcus saw the potential in her. She had the right instincts, the right heart. "Of course, Mr. Carter," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the nerves evident in her eyes. "I've always believed in treating every customer with respect. I'm ready to do whatever it takes to turn things around." Marcus smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Good. You'll be overseeing a complete shift in how we approach customer service. We need to instill a culture where inclusivity is as important as luxury. I want to make sure every person who walks in here feels like they belong. No exceptions." As Sarah nodded, determination setting in, Marcus knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But with Sarah in charge and his commitment to change, he felt confident that this was the start of something new, something better. Over the next few days, Marcus watched the store's atmosphere shift. There was an undeniable energy in the air, one that hadn't been present before. Sarah had taken the reins with confidence, meeting with every team member, discussing new training methods, and setting the tone for a future that was inclusive, respectful, and, above all, customer-centered. She had already implemented new policies. Staff would no longer judge a customer based on their appearance. Instead, they were to focus on delivering a consistent and welcoming experience to every single person who walked through those glass doors. Marcus couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he observed Sarah's leadership in action. Her approach was methodical, grounded in her belief that respect didn't come with a price tag. She started by hosting a series of meetings with the entire staff, reminding them of the core values they were meant to embody. She spoke of creating a space where luxury wasn't exclusive to a certain type of customer. It was about the experience, the service, the respect that was offered to anyone who chose to step into the store. One afternoon, as he stood at the edge of the showroom, watching Sarah lead a new employee training session, Marcus realized something he hadn't fully acknowledged before. The company wasn't just about selling high-end products. It was about selling an experience, a feeling of belonging. And that lesson, the one about inclusivity and not judging a book by its cover, wasn't just important for customers. It was vital for the entire team. The change was palpable. The staff were more engaged, the customers were happier, and even the high-end products felt less like symbols of exclusivity and more like objects of shared appreciation. It wasn't about who could afford it or who looked the part. It was about who deserved the experience, regardless of their background. Marcus smiled to himself, knowing this was only the beginning. In the end, the true measure of luxury was never in the price tag. It was in the way people were made to feel. And now, his store would finally reflect that truth. As weeks passed, Marcus felt a sense of relief settle into his bones. The store had transformed. What once felt like a luxury fortress, guarded by assumptions and elitism, had become a place of warmth and inclusion. Sarah had delivered on her promise. Every customer, whether they were wearing a tailored suit or a pair of faded jeans, was treated with the same level of respect and attention. Marcus watched his customers enter the store, not as outsiders but as guests, greeted with genuine smiles, kind words, and expert service. It wasn't just the customers who had changed. It was the staff. They now understood the importance of being welcoming and empathetic, no matter who walked through the door. Sarah had led the charge with her infectious enthusiasm, and soon the entire team was on board. Training sessions weren't just about product knowledge. They were about cultivating a mindset of respect, regardless of appearance or social status. Every staff member, from the sales associates to the managers, had internalized the idea that luxury wasn't about exclusivity. It was about making people feel valued. One afternoon, Marcus found himself sitting in his office, staring at the sales reports in front of him. The numbers were impressive. More people were walking into the store than ever before, and even the higher-end products were flying off the shelves. But it wasn't the sales figures that made Marcus smile. It was a quiet satisfaction of knowing that his business was thriving not because of the products they sold, but because of the culture they had built. Luxury, he realized, was never about the price tag. It was about how people were treated, the respect they were shown, the sense of belonging they felt. As he looked out his office window, watching the sunset over the city, Marcus knew the true measure of success. It wasn't the profits or the products. It was in the impact he had made, not just on his business, but on the lives of the people who walked through those doors every day, feeling valued and respected. That was a lesson he had learned. When you build with respect at the core, success follows, and it was a success he could be proud of